Clearly, the budget cut excuse is false. If we could have returned to the moon using space shuttle technology this whole time, why didn't NASA do it sooner? Furthermore, in 21st century currency, the entire Apollo program cost $135 billion. By February 2005, the entire space shuttle program had cost NASA $145 billion, meaning the shuttle was $10 billion more expensive than the Apollo project. And yet, somehow, NASA couldn't afford another manned moonshot? I think we all know the true reason why NASA hasn't bothered to go back to the moon in 40 years. Right at the beginning of the space race, the Soviet rocket genius Sergei Korolev had built the USSR what was at the time the most powerful rocket the world had ever seen, the R-7 Semyorka. Capable of lifting a thick-walled spacecraft with a sea-level internal pressure, it set the Soviet Union the milestones of the first satellite, the first human in space, the first unmanned lunar flybys, and today it is still used to launch the Soyuz. In the mid-60s, Russia went on to design what became conceived as the supersized ICBM, the Proton rocket, which was used to send the unmanned Zonda probes around the moon and back. But the rocket Korolev planned to use to beat the Americans to the moon was planned as early as the late 50s. With 30 engines on the first of its 5 stages alone, the N-1 developed even more thrust than the mighty Saturn V. It was built for the sole purpose of flying 2 cosmonauts to the moon with the goal of 1 landing. But as early tests of the R-7 had proved, clustering as little as 4 engines proved difficult. Clustering 30 proved impossible. Although the N-1 was a complete failure, the Russians would succeed in building the most powerful rocket in the world. Energia was even more powerful than the Saturn V, and was capable of launching a 32-ton payload into lunar orbit. Instead, it was used only to launch Buran, the Russian space shuttle, on its one and only unmanned flight. In response to NASA's Orion program, Russia announced that they will be sending cosmonauts to the moon aboard their new spacecraft, the Clipper, a miniature shuttle. Like the new American moon program, the Clipper and its lander would be launched aboard 2 separate craft. But instead of inventing new rockets, Russia plans on using the same R-7 boosters they used to launch the Soyuz. In December 2005, Russia announced that
the winged crew vehicle Clipper would launch atop a Russian Soyuz 2-3 booster and could form the heart of potential Moon or Mars-bound craft.
That same year in August, Russia also responded to the success of Spaceship One, announcing that they could fly tourists around the moon aboard the Soyuz. It was written, quote,
"Passengers would use existing Russian rocket technology, considered stodgy but reliable. They blast off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, riding inside a car-sized Soyuz capsule, and would spend a day orbiting the Earth, awaiting the launch of a Zenit cargo vessel carrying a high-energy upper stage booster. This would dock with the Soyuz on day 2 and propel the capsule to the moon on day 3. The engines would fire, accelerating the capsule to 38,000 km per hour. Once the booster's fuel was depleted, it would drop away and the capsule would spend 2 days coasting to the moon. The capsule would swing around the dark side of the moon, the side we never see from Earth, and coast 100 km from the surface, then head home. On day 9, re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere would begin, ending with a parachute landing on the day.
Given that Russia has had this technology since the dawn of the space race, why has it taken them nearly 50 years to decide to use it for manned lunar exploration? In November 1968, a group of cosmonauts led by Alexei Leonov submitted a proposal to the Politburo, requesting the December 7th circumlunar flight of Zonda 7 to be manned.
We, cosmonauts of the Soviet Union, respectfully ask the Politburo to consider ordering the next circumlunar mission to be manned. We are ready to take the risk, whatever it may bring, to serve the motherland. This is our duty.
This scheduled launch was just weeks before the historic Apollo 8 flight. Their proposal was rejected. In their respective books, Bill Kaysing and Ralph Renee cite the authors of the book Journey to Tranquility. On pages 204 and 205, we find this statement. In the summer of 1963, however, a new light seemed to be shed on the Soviet conundrum, which, to some critics, also illuminated their own case against the hectic speed of Apollo. Sir Bernard Lovell, the British astronomer, whose cooperation in tracking their probes the Russians had often requested, did what no American space policymaker had been able to do. He visited all the major optical and radio observatories in Russia and spent many hours talking about the future of space exploration to the president of the Soviet Academy of Science and many other academicians. On his return, he made a statement which seemed to surprise even him. He said he had found no conviction in the Soviet Union that it was scientifically or even desirable to place a man on the moon. A few weeks ago, he admitted, I was under the firm impression that landing of a human being on the moon was the centerpiece of the Russian space program, but this is not the case. Evidently, the Academy was constantly debating the problems of getting a man to the moon, but the Soviet scientists had identified three insuperable difficulties. These Lovell outlined as he had been intended to in a letter to Hugh Dryden, NASA's deputy administrator. First, the Russians could see no immediate way of protecting cosmonauts from the lethal effects of cosmic radiation. In 1999, Sir Bernard Lovell had this to say to the BBC.
I had frequently asked my Soviet contacts when they intended to send a human being to the moon, and their response was always, when we can be absolutely certain of getting him back alive. And they did not believe that the Americans would do this. And in fact, it's pretty clear that the Americans did take considerable risk.
He went, and Russia opened up the doors to him and showed him everything. And they told him, they said, look, we don't know any way to protect our astronauts from the radiation that's up there. Go tell NASA. Well, if he faithfully reported that to NASA, they paid no attention, kept right ahead and going. Now, if Russia couldn't, protect their astronauts, and their craft and engines were much bigger and stronger than ours, then how the hell did NASA do it? With suits made of silicon rubber and an aluminum hull 2,000, 3,000ths of an inch thick?
Sticks and stones.
Yeah, sticks and stones.
In addition to the dangers of solar radiation, a Dr. Frank Greening from Canada, also known as the nuclear whistleblower, was able to dig up this info on the Van Allen radiation belts, which he shared with Ralph Renee. The December 1983 Journal of Aviation, Space and Environmental Medicine indicated the Van Allen radiation was as high as 280,000 rad per day, which is 11,666 rad per hour. Astonishingly, this is by far in excess of what even James Van Allen stated would have been absorbed traveling through these belts. His measurements indicated that the radiation was only 100 rem per hour. Of course, Van Allen got these readings after he put a tiny lead shield around his Geiger counters. And just who was Dr. Greening's source for this information? An individual called E. Kovalev. Who was Kovalev? He was a scientist for the Institute of Biomedical Problems at the USSR Ministry of Health in Moscow. In the same journal, Kovalev goes on to write, high values of dose equivalent rate with no shielding are typical in the greater part of the near-Earth zone. This should be taken into account both in planning cosmonauts' exit into outer space and designing radiation shielding of the crew compartments of manned orbital stations.